So recently I was asked by somebody I know to recommend a camera for a friend of theirs who was beginning photography. And actually this is the type of question that I get asked by friends of mine quite a lot. My answer usually begins talking about some basic cameras, but then it rambles on a little bit because the first gear, the first camera question, it's a little bit tricky and it's very easy to get overwhelmed by all of the gear choice you have as a photographer, especially a beginner photographer. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the gear I think is most important for beginner photographers. And in particular, what items I think are the most practical ones to buy first. So hopefully I can help you figure out, at least from my experience, what to spend your money on and what not to. So just one or two quick things before we start. This video and the things I mentioned in this video are aimed at the photographer who has already started photography and is at the point where they want to buy their first camera. Secondly, if you add all of these items up, it can get quite expensive quite quickly. So I by no means expect people, or especially beginner photographers, to be able to buy all of this in one go. It's more of a case of starting with a camera, buying a lens, and then adding items on from there as you go. Another thing is that you can always just use your phone. Don't let this list put anybody off taking photos. If you don't have a camera or you can't afford one yet, you can always use your phone and you can edit them on your phone as well. Easy to get started from there. And finally, this video is probably skewed towards my style of photography, my personal preferences, which are landscape, travel, street, lifestyle photography. There are many ways to do it, of course, but I think these tips in this video works for your general photographer as well. The first question most people ask, naturally enough, is which camera should they buy? Should they go Sony, Fuji, Canon, or maybe even something a little cooler like Nikon, which is, by the way, what I used to shoot. Team dad photography all the way. But to be honest, in my opinion, in terms of brand, I don't think it matters all that much. Most cameras nowadays really brilliant. They're all very high tech and all of the leading brands have a pretty good cameras at all levels. But with that said, I do still think that it's a good idea to go for one of the top well-known brands, because these brands generally have a wider range of lenses available, so it'll make it much easier for you to upgrade your kit as you progress. One thing I would recommend though is to buy a camera that is capable of using interchangeable lenses, which means that you can change and swap the lenses on your camera for different focal lengths and different needs as you go. In my opinion, when it comes to gear, lenses are much more important. So it's a good idea to have a camera, even at the beginning, even your very first camera, that will allow you to use many different lenses well into the future, and to have a manufacturer that supports that and supports that with a wide range of lenses available. And on a related note to that, the next question usually is, how much should you spend on your first camera? Now this is probably up for debate, but personally I'm a believer that you shouldn't blow the majority of your budget on a camera at the very beginning. Of course, it depends on who you are. For the purposes of this video, I'm assuming that your average beginner photographer who has like a fixed, relatively low budget. And with that reason in mind, I would avoid blowing all of that budget on your camera at the very beginning. I think it's a much better idea to consider saving some of that budget and spending it on improving your lenses first. The reason I think that is because for beginners, you actually get like a lot of bang for your buck for like a beginner entry-level camera. There's a reason they're called entry-level cameras. They're made for beginners. They're usually easy to use and they usually have all of the basic features to get you started. I also believe that better lenses will get you better photos faster than a better camera. I believe that there is a time to spend money on a high-end camera, but I think that comes a little bit further down the road when you have more experience and you know what you want in your camera a little bit more. When I began, for example, I started with like a €400 Nikon D3200, I think it was called, which at the time was like Nikon's entry-level DSLR, and to be honest, I used it for years. And even after a year or two, after I improved a bit, I was still able to get better photos because I was able to upgrade my lenses and still use it on that entry-level camera. Sure, it would have been better with a better camera, but it was really the lenses that were helping me to progress a little bit faster. And then when the time came, I was able to upgrade and spend the money on a more expensive camera that I knew that I wanted. Not everybody agrees with this philosophy, but from my experience, it's worked pretty well for me. That brings me to the next thing I think most photographers should look to buy, and that's lenses. For me, lenses are the most important piece of equipment that can really make a difference in your photos, especially at the beginning. That doesn't mean that you have to spend a fortune on one either. One or two smart decisions can really go a long way. The first lens you'll come across as a photographer is probably going to be the kit lens that you get with your camera. That'll do absolutely fine at the beginning. You can take photos on that, it'll be perfect, and it'll be great until you can afford a slightly better one. After that, I would recommend getting something like a versatile zoom lens, something like a 24 to 70 millimeter 2.8. These lenses are usually considerably sharper than your kit lens that you're used to, so when you do upgrade to this, you'll probably notice the difference immediately. And they're also quite versatile and you can use them in a lot of different situations. 24 to 70 is a really nice focal length that kind of covers a lot of everyday practical situations in a lot of different types of photography. Most of the main manufacturers like Canon, Nikon, Sony, they'll probably have versions of this lens. But if you want to go a little bit cheaper, you can pick up one of the off-brand ones, something like a Sigma or a Tamron as well. Personally, actually, I use the Sigma 24 to 70 and it's always been a super lens for me. I've had it for years. This is actually my second one, so I think that says a lot. Then after that, I think it's a good idea to consider picking up like a cheap prime lens, something like a 50mm or a 35mm, like a 1.8. I've already made a whole video on the 50mm that I'll link below in the description, and why I think that's a brilliant lens for beginner photographers. But generally these prime lenses are just like another little bit sharper again, that you'll be able to see another little bit of improvement in your photos, like right from the beginning. And they're also really cheap, so it's really easy to pick one up even if your budget is quite small. Then as you progress, you can always add more lenses to your collection. When you start taking photos with your camera, you're also probably going to need some place where you can edit those photos. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you have a good smartphone, you can always edit your photos there, but it's not ideal, and most people will probably want to upgrade to a laptop or a computer eventually, if anything, just to help you manage your photos and your files. I can't really recommend a specific computer here because, in all honesty, I'm not that much of a tech head, so I don't really know what computers are very good for photo editing right now. Personally, I use like a base level M1 iMac for my photo editing these days, and it's always been more than capable of that workload. In general, I'm a pretty big fan of Apple when it comes to creative work and creative software on their computers. They've never given me trouble. So I think if you can swing something like that, it's probably a good starting point. Now, they can be a little bit more expensive, but for photo editing at least, you don't have to go and buy the high-end Macs. If you have aspirations of video editing maybe further down the line, that's something to consider. But for photo editing, I think most of their base level computers will do the job. Especially with the new M1 and M2 chips, they're very good performance for like a relatively low budget. And if you can't afford something like that, I started on like a crappy little, I don't know, a couple of €100 Windows computer, and yeah, it chugged a bit and it was a bit sloppy, but you know, I was able to work away and do fine. So you can always just use the computer you have until it's possible to level up. And on your computer, you'll also probably want to begin editing with an editing tool or an editing software. There are other options out there, most noticeably Capture One, I think is the main competitor now. But personally, I use Adobe Lightroom. And in fact, I don't have any experience with any other one because Lightroom is the only editing software that I've ever used. I've never had a problem with it, so from my experience, I think it's great. I also think it's a great one for beginners because it's not that difficult to learn. Another pro for Lightroom, I think, is that it's also pretty affordable. You can get like an Adobe photographer package for something like €12 a month, which isn't the worst in terms of software subscriptions. Next up is something that a lot of people don't think about when they start photography, and that is accessories. Things like memory cards, batteries, hard drives. When I first began, it took me ages to buy an extra memory card until one morning I got up at 4 AM to go and shoot a beautiful sunrise, only to get there and realize that I actually forgot my memory card and I couldn't take any photos. So that day I drove straight into town to buy a new memory card, and I've never had less than 2 memory cards ever since then. And now I recommend that every beginner should do that as soon as they can. And batteries are the same. It's always a good idea to have a spare battery in your bag and well worth investing in right from the beginning. And that's especially the case if you're taking your cameras out for like a day at a time, or if you're planning on traveling quite a lot, because you'd be surprised how quickly your battery can run down in like a full day of taking photos. And then you have hard drives, somewhere to store and back up your photos. I use the Lacy, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the Lacy Rugged hard drives, the kind of classic orange ones that you see quite a lot. Now, I've got to say, I've heard that some people don't like them and some people have had problems with those hard drives in the past, but I've been using them for like a few years now and I've never had much trouble, so I just continue to use them. And I think that's kind of a general rule of thumb that you'll find with your own photography as well over time. You kind of get used to tools that you like and you get a sense for what's good and what's not, and maybe even just tools that work for you, and you'll probably tend to stick with them as time goes on. But in terms of hard drives, There's plenty of other options out there. I know the SanDisk SSD one, I think, is another really popular choice out there amongst photographers, but really that one is up to you. Things like bags and slings have always been kind of a funny one for me. I've always found them like a little bit overpriced, to be totally honest, or at least the good ones anyway. But of course, we all need somewhere to carry our cameras all the same, so we need to get something. To be honest, the one that I use is like a pretty cheap one I got on Amazon, and in all honesty, it works pretty great. And I think something like that is like a good option for most beginners as well, rather than spending a whole pile of money up front, because as I said, they do get a little bit pricey. Maybe then down the road, when you know your photography a little bit better, and you know the types of photography trips that you do more often, you can spend more money on a bag with the features that you know you need. For example, if you get into something like adventure photography, then you'll probably need a pretty robust bag, but those bags can get very expensive, so maybe it's better to wait until you know for sure before buying one straight out the block. Because if you end up getting into something like street photography, well then maybe you don't carry that much gear on you, and you don't really need that big of a bag at all. So it all does depend. Another good option at the beginning is just maybe getting something like a smaller bag, or even something like a padded insert that you can put inside your normal backpack. I had one of those at the very beginning and it worked really great until I eventually just upgraded because I had more cameras and lenses and stuff. And then there are things like slings and straps for your camera. I've used a few of those in the past down through the years, but right now I don't really use anything. But I probably would recommend getting a nice one if you can afford it. They will make your photography a lot more comfortable, especially if you're out and about, like walking a lot. I just don't have one right now, to be honest, because I've been too lazy to buy one. I have this little clip instead that I put on the strap of my backpack. It's called the Capture by Peak Design. It's useful, but honestly with a bigger camera and bigger lens, it can feel a little bit heavy on your shoulder. So it's not ideal all the time. When I'm absolutely stuck, I'll probably just use the strap that you get with the camera. But again, to be honest, they usually suck and they're really uncomfortable. So I would recommend, if you have a little bit of extra money, buying like a comfortable strap or a comfortable sling for your camera. Okay, so that's it. The most basic, but in my opinion, important things you should look to buy when you start photography. There are probably some other things that I think I could add to this list, things like maybe comfy shoes or a warm winter jacket if you live in a cold country, but I can cover those another day. And I know a lot of these items that I listed today might seem a little bit basic, like not the flashy photography gear that you hear online all the time, but honestly, I think if you focus on this list and gradually work your way through it, that'll get you most of the way there. I think with the items that I outlined here, I think it covers like a really wide range of photography, and as a beginner you'll be able to get a taste for most things with this list. But of course, like I always try to say, the most important thing is just finding a way to get out there and starting to take photos. But please do let me know any questions in the comments if you have them, or even any of your own thoughts or experiences. Thanks again for watching. I'll be back with another video really soon.